You've got some estimates, 12 million, others over 20 million people who are here illegally.
Bear Stearns report.
Yeah, who still consider their primary allegiance to be their home country, whether it's Venezuela or Nicaragua or Mexico, or Southeast Asian countries who are coming either directly through the ports or first through Mexico and then across the Mexican border. If we were to end up at war, an economic or a military war with any of those nations, the number of people here that still feel their allegiances to that prime country is a very dangerous thing, it seems to me. And it's not because they're people of different color or different language or different origin. It's because they're people that still owe allegiance to a different sovereign. They never have become part of our body politic, our government by consent, to use the language of the Declaration of Independence. And we ought not to be surprised that they owe their allegiance. If I were caught up in France and we ended up at war with France, I would still owe my allegiance to the United States, and I'd be doing everything I could while there to make sure my country, prevailed. But there's something much more insidious going on both sides of the political aisle that really angers me, because I think it is a repudiation of all that America stands for and all that is good of what we stand for. And it has this uncanny reflection of the arguments made in the old slave South. On the one hand, you've got the Democrats, who are the social welfare party. And the longer you have huge groups of people that rely on government entitlements, the more political power the Democrats can gain from that. So they have a vested interest in keeping a subclass population. The Republicans, or the big business wing of Republicans, have this vested interest in having not a new labor pool, but a new illegal labor pool, because of the way they can take advantage of them and treat them almost slave labor. And the arguments made by the Chamber of Commerce and the Wall Street Journal have an uncanny parallel for the arguments made by John C. Calhoun and the old defense of slavery, and it's, our economy depends on this and what have you. And it is a travesty that those two positions have gained enough majority support to force the government to ignore our immigration laws. In 1776, Thomas Jefferson drafts a version of the Declaration of Independence, his early draft, that criticized slavery. They force him to take that language out, but the idea shared across the founding generation, North and South alike, was that slavery was a necessary evil to be abolished as soon as possible. By the 1820s, John C. Calhoun and others are arguing that slavery is a positive good. It's the foundation, the economic foundation of the South. You pull the rug out from under it, the economy is destroyed, and it's worse for whites as well as for blacks. And they start making this economic argument in defense of slavery, and that takes root, and it lasts with us for generations. And I think what the Wall Street Journal's position and the Chamber's position is nearly identical to it. Agriculture would just be brought to its knees if we had to pay the prevailing wage, and we had to, suffer all the threats of lawsuits if we, and all the other things that go with it. They've got a docile labor pool that they are able to put to bear to generate either greater profits or lower consumer prices on agricultural goods. And that's, I think, fairly despicable. But also a function of this idea of equality, that everybody has to come together and agree to the kind of government they're going to have. So the only legitimate government you have is one grounded in consent. So you have human rights, natural rights that you have as human beings, and then you have a government that some portion of human beings decide to create by consent among themselves in order to protect those human rights as best as they think possible. And what we do in the United States might be different than what they do in Canada or France or Mexico, but the people in each of those countries come together to try and decide what works best for them. It's consent of all concerned. To say that I have a human right to insist that you accept me as a member of your political community violates the notion of consent from our side. And when I have then birthright citizenship, that means I can illegally enter your country, give birth, and that demand entry into your political system by virtue of an illegal act. That's unilateral claims to entitlement to citizenship, rather than what our founders did, which was this notion of mutual consent in order to create the political regime. It doesn't violate your human rights to say, I'm not going to have you as part of my political regime, any more than it violates your human rights for me to insist that you accept me into yours. We can no more say in a statute of Congress, everybody in Mexico City is now citizens. If I were them, I would say, wait a minute, who made you our master? Well, what they're doing is the reverse of that. Everybody in Mexico City that comes to Arizona demands citizenship, and you have nothing to say about it. For a member of Congress to be as ignorant of the history of the Three-Fifths Clause as Representative Jackson was astounding to me. The Three-Fifths Clause was actually a clause designed to aid slaves by giving less power to the slave owners than they otherwise would have had. And it was not all blacks were treated as three-fifths and all whites were treated as whole persons. It was if you were slaves, your population, three-fifths of the population counted for representation purposes, because if it counted you entirely, you weren't voting, your master was. The master would have greater power in Congress and therefore make it more likely that they would prevent an abolition of slavery. And if you go back and you look at the debates and what they were trying to do, they were trying to create a government that would recognize the principle of equality, that would compromise with an existing institution while they tried to get the government established, so that in the long run, the possibility of getting rid of slavery would be real. And the last thing you wanted to do was give representation to the Southern leaders based not just on their own votes, but on the voting power of the entire slave population. It would be hard to ever abolish slavery. And that's all it was. But people that have different vested interests in trying to say this was a racist founding like to ignore that, and they completely distort what that clause is there for.